Planes. Airplanes, if you will. One of mankind's greatest inventions. Machines that are able to get humanity off of the ground and into the air, without the need for vast amounts of combustible gases. You may have wondered how humans can throw a big hunk of metal full of people in the air and not have them all die on landing. Well, that's not magic, folks. It's just the wizardry of aerodynamics at work. Aerodynamics aren't exclusive to airplanes, however. Any object that is immersed in the air is affected by aerodynamics, just in different ways. You may have wondered how humanity even came up with the idea of planes in the first place. Well, in 1903, Wilbur and Orville Wright invented their first airplane prototype, and they called it the Wright Flyer. Real creative name, I know. The first ever flight of the Wright Flyer achieved a total astonishing 12 seconds of airtime with an incredible top speed of about 11 kilometers per hour. By today's standards, that's not at all impressive, but in the early 1900s you'd be exhilarated if your dinner consisted of more than 5 beans and a slice of bread. But what about the hard-working Canadians of this country? What have they done in the pursuit of flight? Well, Wallace Rupert Turnbull was the first person to build a wind tunnel in Canada. Wind tunnels are basically big old tubes that you force a bunch of air through to simulate the airflow of a plane flying. Wallace Rupert Turnbull built his wind tunnel alongside Alexander Graham Bell, the man who created the Aerial Experiment Association, whose goal was to gather engineers and design as many airplanes as possible. One of Alexander Graham Bell's associates, Thomas Selfridge, created and designed an aircraft called the Red Wing, to which Alexander Graham Bell's other associate, Frederick Walker Baldwin, flew, and promptly ended up crashing after the second flight. However, this did make Baldwin the first Canadian to ever fly an aircraft. Other notable Canadian pilots include Billy Bishop, William George Barker, and Alan Arnott MacLeod, who were all awarded the Victoria Cross, a symbol of valor and the most prestigious award one can be granted in the Canadian military. What about career paths? What opportunities are available through aviation? Well, to name a few, there's aerospace engineering and aircraft maintenance, pilots, flight attendants, air traffic controllers, and airport operations specialists. However, there are many other aspects to aviation than just planes. For example, airport operations specialists have training in business management and allocation of human resources, and are responsible for ensuring the airports run smoothly. What about piloting? Well, pilots are required to have graduated from a certified flying or aviation school, and a university or college diploma is sometimes required. They're also required to have a commercial pilot's license or an air transport pilot's license, but other licenses are required depending on different types of aircraft a pilot will be flying, just to name a few. Now, onto the part of the video where I compress hours of research into 8 minutes. So, how does an airplane actually fly? To put it simply, we don't really know. That sounds hard to believe. I mean, humans didn't just randomly come up with this idea, right? There are currently 2 leading theories, which are both accepted but incomplete. One of the most widely accepted theories uses the Bernoulli principle, which basically states that the top of the wing has a longer surface than the bottom of the wing, making a difference in pressure to produce lift. Bernoulli's principle is not wrong. There is more generated lift with a curved upper wing shape, but this isn't actually required to generate a lift force. Take a paper airplane for example. The bottom and top of the wings are exactly the same sizes and they fly without issue. This also completely neglects that planes have the ability to fly upside down, where in that case the sizes of the wings would be reversed and no lift would be generated. The other widely accepted theory is the Newtonian theory. The Newtonian theory explains lift by stating that air is deflected under the wing and produces an upward force on the wing as it is pushed away. This theory fails to explain the lower pressure found above the wing than below the wing. Mark Drella, an expert in fluid dynamics, explained the mystery behind the lower pressure above the wing, stating that a vacuum is formed and the air further above the wing is quickly pushed into that space, still leaving enough of a vacuum to push the air to the back of the wing. But even so, there is no cut and dry answer, only formulas and equations. So allow me to explain them. Here is the formula for lift. This formula may look complicated, but there are only 4 main variables: coefficient of lift, wing surface area, the density of the air, and good old velocity. The surface area of the wing refers to the sum of the total area of each face of the wing, and is proportional to the lift force. So the larger the surface area of the wing, the larger the lift force. The density of the air around the object is determined by the mass of the fluid, in this case it's air, divided by the volume of the fluid. It determines how much mass is contained per unit of measurement around the object, which means that the denser the fluid is, the larger the lift force that will be produced. The density of the air is also affected by weather conditions, making it sometimes difficult to predict. Velocity refers to the speed of the object or the air around it, and it has a quadratically proportional relationship to the force of lift, meaning that the faster the object or the air around it is, the larger the lift force will be. But since it has a quadratic relationship, velocity will have the largest effect on the lift force out of the four variables in the equation. Now, onto the lift coefficient. The complicated part about the lift coefficient is that it is not a universal constant and can only be determined experimentally by observing the force of lift on the object and then solving for the lift coefficient. However, what is universal about the coefficient of lift is what affects it, the shape of the wing, along with the angle of attack of the wing. I'm not going to go in depth about the mathematics behind the shape of the wing because, dear lord, so we're mostly going to focus on the angle of attack for now. The angle of attack is important for keeping planes in the air, because as the angle of attack increases, more lift is generated. But there is a limit. If you increase the angle of attack too far, it will result in what's called stalling. As the airplane stalls, the stream of air flowing over the aircraft's wings becomes separated from the curve of the wing, and so the plane is unable to generate enough lift to counteract the force of gravity acting on it. This makes the plane much harder to control. So all we really need to gather from this is that the angle of attack of the wing is proportional to the lift force up until a point of about 15 degrees for most aircraft, which therefore makes the lift coefficient also proportional to the lift force. Here's another example. Helicopters fly on the same principle as airplanes. The blades of the helicopter spin and produce upward lift. Since there is no forward velocity, all of the lift generated is directed upwards, and no forward velocity is required to stay in the air. But if a helicopter pilot wants to move horizontally, they must tip forward to change the horizontal component of the lift force. On the topic of horizontal components, let's talk about drag. Here is the formula for the force of drag. Drag, also known as air resistance, is a form of friction, thus it has similar properties to friction. The drag force operates in the direction that opposes the motion of the object. The force of drag formula consists of the coefficient of drag, the cross-sectional area of the object, the density of the air, and the velocity of the object or the air around it. The force of drag formula shares similarities with the force of lift formula, the only difference being the coefficient of drag and the cross-sectional area. But first, let's determine the relationship between the force of drag and these four variables. If you are unaware of what the cross-sectional area is, think of a cross-sectional area as the area inside a cake that has been cut open. The cross-sectional area has a proportional relationship with the force of drag, so a larger cross-sectional area will result in an increase in drag. The density of the air around the object is proportional to the force of drag, and the velocity is quadratically proportional to the force of drag. Now, let's take a closer look at the coefficient of drag. Much like the lift coefficient, the drag coefficient is not universal and can only be determined experimentally by measuring the force of drag and then solving for the drag coefficient. Once we have the force of drag though, the coefficient of drag can be calculated, and since the coefficient of drag is proportional to the force of drag, it means that the higher the coefficient of drag is, the more drag that will be generated. But now you must be thinking to yourself, what even are the coefficients of lift and drag? So allow me to explain. Firstly, let's talk about the coefficient of lift. The lift coefficient refers to how effective the wing is at deflecting air downwards to generate a lift force. For example, increasing a plane's angle of attack during flight will yield a larger coefficient of lift, and thus create a larger lift force. Similar to the coefficient of friction, the coefficient of lift can never be zero, with one exception. If the object is in deep space or a powerful vacuum chamber, there is no air for the object to generate lift with, thus the coefficient of lift will be zero. Since the coefficient of lift can never realistically be zero on Earth, that means that every object that is moving through the air is generating lift. But the reason why you don't fly away from Earth every time you walk is that since the force of gravity is so much larger than the force of lift, the effect of the lift is basically immeasurable. The coefficient of drag works similarly. Objects with a low coefficient of drag are more aerodynamically efficient than objects with a higher coefficient of drag. For example, average streetcars will have a typical drag coefficient of about 0.25 to 0.3, while something like a human in a standing position will have a drag coefficient of about 1.0 to 1.3. For the same reasons as the coefficient of lift, the coefficient of drag cannot equal zero unless the object is contained within a vacuum. So, with all this information gathered, how can we use it to maximize the efficiency of an aircraft? Firstly, let's talk about how we can maximize lift in an aircraft. The first physical change we can make is to the surface area of the wing. Since the surface area of the wing is proportional to the lift force, we know that by increasing the wing surface area, we will also be increasing the lift. But at the same time, the weight of the wing also has to be considered. Having a larger wing will increase lift, but if it makes the plane so heavy that the force of gravity overpowers the force of lift, then it pretty much defeats the entire purpose of having a large wing. Furthermore, changing the shape of the wing to a droplet shape will also increase the lift coefficient and therefore produce more lift. Now, let's talk about reducing the effect of drag to try and preserve as much fuel as possible, to allow the plane to fly farther and longer. Well, the first physical change that we can make to an aircraft is to reduce the cross-sectional area as much as possible. Thinning the wings decreases the cross-sectional area of the aircraft, but also decreases the strength of the wings at the same time. Most planes today are made out of aluminum, a strong but also lightweight material. There is a sweet spot between structural stability and aerodynamic efficiency, which humanity has pretty much already mastered at this point. The next physical change that can be made to an aircraft is to reduce its volume. This can be done by simply reducing the amount of physical space that the aircraft takes up. Of course, it depends on the type of plane that you're trying to make. Airliners have huge cabins to hold hundreds of passengers and luggage, while a fighter jet really only needs space to hold 1 to 2 people. The other variables that affect lift and drag are the angle of attack along with the velocity, but they aren't restricted to the physical build of the aircraft and can be controlled mid-flight. Additionally, the density of the air affects both lift and drag, but changing it is out of humanity's abilities for the time being. So with that being said, the air is confusing, but is also surprisingly simple if you put the effort into trying to understand it. We go about our daily lives immersed in something that we rarely ever acknowledge or understand, but I hope I helped you understand it a little bit better. Thank you.